Welcome to the Uncommon Living podcast, where we host dialogues in human resilience. I'm Thomas Seager. I'm an associate professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering at Arizona State University and the CEO of the Morozko Forge Ice Bath Company. My guest today is Dr. Nasha Winters. She's a naturopathic oncologist, and we're talking about metabolic approaches to cancer. Dr. Nasha is a cancer survivor who uses therapies that target the mitochondria to improve cancer treatment outcomes. She and I discuss the mitochondrial origins of cancer and how metabolic therapies can help cancer patients. She's also a cancer survivor. She tells me about her own diagnosis with ovarian cancer at the age of 19, and she describes some of the mechanisms that explain how children get cancer. Dr. Nasha Winters, thank you for joining me on the Uncommon Living podcast.
It's so fun to be here. As I was saying right before we got on, I've actually been following you and your work for some time because the things that you study are very near and dear to me as a clinician and someone who gets to be you're at the bench and I'm at the bedside. So we're going to have a lot of fun talking about this, I'm sure, today.
I'm flattered to hear you say that because I have been learning about the metabolic theory and the metabolic foundations of cancer now for almost 5 years, and I didn't think anybody was paying attention to what we had to say.
It sometimes feels that way.
Your name first came up to me because our very first edition of the Uncommon Living podcast, it featured Frank Tortorici. And
nice.
Frank was there to talk about Tourette's and its origins in vaccine injury, but I asked him about his sister. And his sister, who is a nurse in oncology, had breast cancer. Frank mentioned your name because his sister, now keep in mind, this is someone embedded in the centralized medical system in oncology. She refused chemotherapy. She wanted to see you. And she was treated, according to Frank, with like a mini chemotherapy, but he mentioned in particular mistletoe. And I had to go look that up, including finding your book, Mistletoe. I discovered that mistletoe has been used in Europe, that in Germany, there are approved protocols for using mistletoe in an oncological setting, but there's very few people in the United States who will prescribe or have any knowledge of how to dose mistletoe. And I thought that would be a good place to start with our audience for this reason. What I've looked up in the library is that one of the mechanisms of actions of mistletoe is through the mitochondria.
Yes.
And that is something that our audience, which is getting into the ice bath and learning about brown fat and mitobiogenesis, our audience is more familiar with. So I'm hoping that you can give us a little bit of a primer on what you're doing with mistletoe for cancer patients.
Well, I mean, first of all, near and dear to my heart. So I love it when someone asks me to talk about this. A little bit of clarification, well, not even clarification, a little context, I guess, would be really helpful. This past September 2024, I took a group of 19, my colleagues and I took a group of 19 clinicians from the United States and Canada to Europe to tour all of the main mistletoe manufacturers, and also 3 hospitals, inpatient hospitals, where mistletoe is used alongside standard of care oncology practices of things like chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, even in addition to things like hyperthermia and even IV vitamin C in these hospitals. And the biggest kicker is that it's all covered by their healthcare system. Right. And I took these doctors because I'd been traveling and experiencing this for decades. But I think that no one living in North America thinks that's possible. You know, we are all really led to believe that these are alternative or somehow fringe. And yet since 1917, mistletoe has been a treatment for cancer. They can absolutely say that in other parts of the world outside of the United States. So it is an on-label treatment for cancer. in these places. And so I just think that's really an important, powerful place to start with your listeners to understand that this is not fringe, what we're talking about. Maybe I'll take a pause there and see if you want me to fill
It's a
anything
good
else there.
point. There is a perception in what people will call alternative cancer treatments that you've got to go to Mexico and meet a witch doctor to do something that would be dangerous and never approved by any sort of developed country populated by people from traditional medical schools.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to debunk that perception. What I'm trying to say is mistletoe does not belong in that category. Mistletoe has been, as you've said, used for medicinally for a century. Mistletoe has a reputation that goes back 1,000 years for promoting fertility. And of course, what is fertility if not mitochondrial health? And so part of the folk wisdom and the science, they intersect in case studies in patients who have used mistletoe therapies to improve their cancer treatment outcomes. And so we must dispense with this idea that mistletoe is somehow I don't know, snake oil or some other grift. These are clinicians who are reputable prescribing it. And from what I've read, you have to be careful with the dosage, because when you're stimulating the mitochondria, too much is toxic. And that's classical hormetic stress curve stuff.
Exactly. And I love that you recognized immediately, because most clinicians, at least, would not immediately recognize the impact that mistletoe has on the mitochondria. And we've not even done a lot of really good, in my opinion, although I'm hoping that's changing, and I'm part of that solution, I hope, is that we actually do want to see the impact of, say, mistletoe on cell respiration. So there's you're the scientist here, we can actually use a tool called Seahorse technology, which can actually measure the impact of substances on mitochondrial respiration. And the few very sort of out of the United States studies that have been done on this, it shows very much, in fact, that mistletoe has impact on the complexes of the mitochondria. And what that tells me is, when I think about in the integrative world of oncology, there are a lot of substances that act as photosensitizing agents. So we can even use chemotherapy. So what's known as the red devil, or the adriamycin, doxorubicin family, is actually a well-known sensitizing agent, meaning that it interacts, the cell will then interact with light in a meaningful way. The same thing with things like curcumin, EGCG, which is a component of green tea extract. Vitamins, so several of the B vitamins, niacin in particular, and others, can actually act as a photosensitizing agent, which can become more of a reflective and absorptive surface to help create more energy in the body through our complexes of our mitochondria. And so I always have thought or questioned whether or not mistletoe was always just a really powerful photosensitizing agent that really sort of opened up the pores, if you will, the complexes of the mitochondria to actually receive whatever therapy you're bringing on board, because it has always had a reputation of playing very well with others. So it's not contraindicated with standard of care chemo or radiation or even immune therapies. We're a little more hesitant and careful of how we approach it with CAR T. But otherwise, checkpoint inhibitors, no problem whatsoever. In fact, I think it protects against the side effects when used appropriately. Because to your point, if we put too much of a good thing in to stimulate our mitochondria, whether that's a deep fasted state, too much hyperbaric oxygen, too much high dose IV vitamin C, too much chemo, maximum tolerated dose therapies, we overwhelm the reactive oxygen species that goes into the system and just sort of takes out the healthy along with the diseased. And so nuance is the key here. And I believe that for the most part, when you are a trained provider and the use of this very well, studied therapy and very well utilized therapy, you learn a nuanced approach to it, which will make or break the patient experience. And so I really appreciate that you brought up first the mitochondria, and second, even the fact that too much of a good thing is too much. And so it's got to be a place. This isn't a protocol by any means, but it certainly asks a lot of questions that we've not yet fully answered.
Dr. Nasha, I'm so glad that you're bringing these topics up, because there is a difference between mitochondrial support and mitochondrial stimulation. You might take magnesium. It's very difficult to overdose on magnesium. You
Yeah.
key it out. And the magnesium is essential for hundreds of enzymatic metabolic reactions. It's essential for mitochondrial function. You could take almost as much as you want because it supports mitochondria. But mitochondrial stimulation is different. A good example is metformin. Metformin is a mitochondrial toxin, and it will stimulate mitobiogenesis. It will reduce your blood glucose levels in the short term. And so it's become the frontline treatment for type 2 diabetes. Hey, take metformin. But then patients, after several months of constant daily metformin dosing, will report to their endocrinologists, my numbers have stopped improving. Oh, they're actually getting a little bit worse. And now a well-meaning endocrinologist might say, well, more metformin, which is going in exactly the wrong direction.
Exactly.
Those things that are supportive, they're fine. Do them every day, layer them on. But those things that are stimulative, exercise is one of these. The ice bath is one of these. They must be cycled. They must come with variance. You need feast and you need fasting. You need cold and you need warmth. You need exercise and you need rest. And so it sounds like mistletoe, being on that classic hormetic stress curve, is a way of stimulating mitochondria. We know, according to Thomas Seyfried, that cancer originates in mitochondrial defects, and that the defects in the nucleic DNA are downstream of the defective mitochondria. So if we can give these mitochondria a little bit of a boost, that's wonderful. They might create more reactive oxygen species. Those ROS might stimulate mitobiogenesis, but we also need to give them a rest. We need to give them that recovery time, lest they be in chronic stress. Does that sound right?
It's 100% right. And I think what's happened in the field of oncology in particular for the past 75 years is this need, and not just in standard of care oncology, even in the alternative or integrative world, we feel like we have to push as hard as possible. And what people don't understand, and that I now train clinicians all over the globe to learn, is you will push people literally off the cliff. And the vast majority of patients are actually succumbing to treatment side effects, the overwhelm, versus the cancer itself. It's far more likely for you to die from cachexia, which is a metabolic derangement, which is some people look at that, in standard of care and say, oh, that's just get more you just need to eat more calories to prevent the weight loss. It's not a calorie-based process. It's an inflammatory driven process and an insulin driven process. So you can actually make it worse by overfeeding those people, and especially overfeeding them the wrong food sources. Just like you mentioned, if I gave mistletoe every single day, it would backfire on that patient very quickly, or if I heavily cold plunged people every single day. So that concept in which we've been applying these things to standard of care oncology and beyond is this maximum tolerated dose approach, which is that let's napalm the field and see what's left. And boy, howdy, I am so in love with the people like Dr. Gatenby out of Moffitt and a couple other researchers actually in Arizona and Utah that are looking more at this adaptive approach. And it speaks exactly to what you just described. And even Dr. Seyfried points this out, this press pulse. We call it more push pause because there is a time for both. And even in the field of extreme sports and whatnot, there's a great, I cannot remember his name, out of University of Colorado, I believe, who has some of the most amazing athletes because it's not about how he trains them. It's actually about how he rests them. And so this is where I think medicine is going in general, because I think we all have the belief, like if a little bit's good, a lot more is better.
It's exactly what people believe. That's the American way.
It sure is. And I think that this is where the conversation is starting to change, that we recognize, boy, I mean, you said it so beautifully. It's like, and I'm even thinking about Viktor Frankl, I think is the person who quotes this about really the real medicine, the real power happens in the pause. And that's in all things, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, definitely pharmacologically, and otherwise. So I'm excited that these conversations are happening and that people at the bench and people at the bedside and biohackers and just curious consumers, we're all kind of landing at the same crossroad together.
You and I both brought up Thomas Seyfried.
Yeah.
We've both been following his work, and he's done so much to popularize the metabolic theory. However, I have a criticism, which I haven't sent to him. I'm going to share it with you first.
Okay.
I think to reach a larger audience, he is guilty of oversimplifying. So he goes on, Stephen Bartlett's Diary of a CEO, and he says things that are easy to understand. He makes it seem like, well, you just cut out the glucose, you cut out the glutamine, and, cancer's it's all solved. Thomas Seyfried, like me, is a PhD, not a clinician. He's not treating patients, although he might study patient outcomes. And where he oversimplifies, you take over. You say, well, hang on a second. Let's look at sleep. Let's look at vitamin D. Let's look at diet in an approach that's not just keto all the time, but let's look at some of the herbs and the plants that must be incorporated into a diet that is supportive of cancer treatment outcomes. Will you tell us sort of, after we've digested the Seyfried simplification, what comes next, Dr. Nasha?
Well, first of all, I love that. And it's funny because I have gotten, I'm very fond of Dr. Seyfried. I know he's a little firecracker out there, but as he's frustrated, right? Like, I get it. I mean, I've been having these conversations for 30 years too, and it's still like, how in the world? And to your point, it is simplistic in some ways, and he's definitely at the bench. But I will tell you, no one will respond to your email or questions or with compassion faster than that man. He literally answers thousands of emails a month from patients reaching out to him, even though he is not a clinician, and he gently guides them elsewhere. And he has said to me, I mean, after he read my book, he literally, he wrote a lovely endorsement, but he also said almost exactly what you just said, Professor Seager, of you pick it up where I leave it off, and he himself in multiple conversations and even at conferences where we've piggybacked off each other and lecturing, either me first or following him, he's very, very much in life and living it and discussing it, very much understand the rest of the terrain needs to come into play. But when he's got those little opportunities to have a soundbite or whatever social media chooses to give the clip, it does oversimplify it, right? But I know in reality, he gets that it's a lot more than that. So to your point, because I've been at this so long through my own journey, I realized that there were certain drivers. Well, let me back it up again. We know that one of the impacts on the mitochondria are the fuel sources you feed it of your food choices. I look at 9 other sort of drops in the bucket that you alluded to that also impact and go directly to the mitochondria. And so the way I think about the mitochondria is the mitochondria has 3 main jobs. Its first job is to be a receiver of information. Okay, very simply, it's a sponge. It takes it all in: light, sound, thought, energy, perceived or otherwise, food, water, toxins, medications, supplements, herbs, all the things are taken in. And to your point, we're taking in a heck of a lot more today than we ever have, right? A lot more. They've been exposed to things that, 170 million years in the making, and they're getting a lot more in this last 150 years than they had in the 170 million combined, or 170,000 combined, right? So that's what I just go, whew. Second job is to translate that input. And so if that's working well, it's got a lot to mill through. There's a lot of information there to make sense of and to sort of pattern recognize. And the way it lands in each of us is going to be a different pattern or a different recognition, that translation. And then the third major job is how it signals or communicates or responds to the environment, out to the surrounding mitochondria, surrounding cytoplasm, surrounding organelles, cells, tissues, organs, the whole structure, and even beyond our structure, because they're emitting light, and that light can be actually picked up outside of our bodies as well. It sounds esoteric, but it's just quantum, it's measurable in these times where we are today in the scientific realm. But that's the piece that I think people forget, is that we want our human nature is we want to look for a single target and a single treatment. And I think that's why Dr. Seyfried is both loved and, feared, or how, or frustrated against, because he does kind of hyper focus on this sort of one target, one treatment. And that does unfortunately seem to invalidate him, but it really doesn't. It's like what he's showing is that piece is absolutely critical, but there's at least 9 other pieces and beyond that are just as critical. And if as we always say, you can't like exercise away a shitty diet, right? Or you can't, do everything perfect, but be up at 2 a.m. searching the internet and expect that your mitochondria aren't responding to that, circadian rhythm disruption and screen time and, awake during the hours that your body should actually be resting and digesting and taking out the garbage in the brain and the liver. And so these are the types of things that I love to dig into with people, is helping them understand what else is contributing to that mitochondrial bucket.
This is super helpful, because where Seyfried is very good is his devastating takedown of the somatic mutation theory. It's a terrible theory. Nixon essentially codified it when he said, we're going to found the National Cancer Institute. We're going to cure cancer by fighting a war. In your book, you're critical of that metaphor, because you say the battle never bothers to concern itself with the root causes. And Seyfried is very good at establishing the root causes in the mitochondria and not in the nucleus. So we must target the mitochondria with our therapies if we expect to have any sort of positive outcomes.
Absolutely.
So that's very helpful. You've brought up, though, the function of the mitochondria, not just the defect when it's broken, but what does it do when it's working well? And if I was listening carefully, it was sensing, translating, and signaling.
Yeah.
This goes very well with things that I've learned from Dr. Richard Frye. He is Richard.
Richard is part of our lab in Arizona. So,
Fantastic.
And he's who taught me all about the seahorse and his work, 600 plus publications in autism, and fascinating, brilliant fella. I forget that you guys would have to know each other.
He is the one who first showed me the seahorse. He walked me around his lab and he showed me it's very involved analytically. There are a number, just as an example, there are a number of tests that you can buy sort of in a bottle to test your mitochondrial function.
Yeah.
And I don't trust any of them. The seahorse, if I understand it, is at the leading edge of analytic power when it comes to studying the mitochondria. And he can show how mitochondrial respiration improves when he gives them, for example, the folate support that the mitochondria need, or CoQ10, or any other sort of supportive nutritional metabolic approach to mitochondria. And then he notices the difference in his autism patients, because we learned autism also originates in defects of mitochondria. So we'll be able to circle back to that. But one of the things that Richard told me at that time, what is the mitochondria that govern the landscape of the epigenome. Everything that you described, the sensing, the translating, the signaling, is encapsulated in this idea that the mitochondria will switch genes on and off by modifying the epigenome so that the genome is now better adapted to its environment.
Yes.
Well, what sort of environment are we in? You were talking about all the new sort of assaults on the mitochondria. There are principally 4 roots to mitochondria injury. And we talk a lot about carbohydrates. It's okay to eat, the whole shelf of baked goods one time. If you can get yourself back into ketosis and give yourself, a mitochondria arrest, it's really excess carbohydrates without stopping. Ben Bickman pointed out, we had him on the podcast, and he said, people are eating 6-7 times a day. They're getting 70% of their energetic intake from carbohydrates. Their mitochondria are never getting a break. So it's excess carbohydrates without a break. But you also brought up the circadian rhythm. If you don't sleep, Your body is not making the melatonin that it needs. Mitochondria make their own melatonin, and they
Exactly.
do this to protect themselves from reactive oxygen species. So
Right.
if you don't have a good light
Yeah.
environment, if you don't have good sleep hygiene, you can mess your mitochondria up. You mentioned in your book seed oils, and you
Yeah.
talked about some of the inflammatory and oxidative effects of the seed oils that would
Right.
certainly disrupt mitochondrial function.
Right.
And then the fourth one, which you've only touched on, I'm going to call it non-native EMFs. And this is something
Mm,
that Jack Kruse is really big on.
yeah. Oh, yeah.
Your mitochondria are sensitive to electromagnetic frequencies. So that could be
Yes.
light outside the visible spectrum. It could
Yeah.
be radiation. It could be your 5G. It
Yeah.
could be certainly sound, vibration, other forms. It could be mechanical. It doesn't have to be electromagnetic. And so all of these things are ways of messing up your mitochondria that didn't necessarily exist before the invention of Crisco or before the invention of the radio. And so I wanted to give you
Yeah.
a chance to expand upon when the mitochondria are functioning well. Everybody says, well, they're the powerhouse of the cell. They produce ATP. You haven't mentioned that at all. You've
I
said they
know.
sense, they translate, and they signal. Will you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, first of all, you just told this, you basically did the synopsis of the book and the synopsis of the expanded edition that will come out in 2027 at its 10-year anniversary, because that book is still very relevant when it came out in 2017. But there's really not much we'd take away, actually, but there's a hell of a lot more we'd add. And so there's about a 75% increase of what we're expecting to bring to this next one. So it's like, think of this as the primer, and what's coming is like the graduate level, right?
Okay,
Because
I'm going to interrupt. The book is
please.
The Metabolic Approach to Cancer. The subtitle is Integrating Deep Nutrition, the Ketogenic Diet, and Non-Toxic Bio-Individualized Therapies. It's 2017. And
Yeah.
before the podcast, I was saying, oh, it's getting a little dated. There's been so much research. And you're informing me it will be updated. But I don't want anyone in the audience who is
Right.
facing an immediate issue to hesitate. They should get the 2017 edition. It is so much different. It is packed with information they are not going to get from their oncologist, and they need to know what's in the book because it will improve the traditional. When I say traditional, I shouldn't even use that word. It
I
will
know.
improve their allopathic medical treatment outcomes. If you're going to
Yes.
go through chemo, and you've pointed out that chemo is iatrogenic injury. Chemo is designed to injure the body. You hope that you can
Yeah.
calibrate it so it kills just the cancer and not the host. But of course it kills the host. The chemo can be the death of the patient, even when the patient is trying to use chemo as a treatment to avoid death by cancer. Ketogenic diet will improve chemo outcomes. They will hasten the recovery. They will, and we have very little clinical data, but we have some good case studies on this.
Yeah.
They will support the allopathic cancer outcomes. So this is my aside.
Mhm.
Still get the book because you don't have time to wait for 2027 if you're facing an acute situation right now. And
I appreciate
with
that,
that
Doc.
interruption, I should allow you to get back to
No.
what you were trying to say.
Well, I'm really glad that you said that, because it's nothing in there is dated. It's just that there's new information on
Right.
top of it, and I think
Right.
that's the key. It's not like, oh, it's throw all that away. It doesn't. It's not relevant anymore. It's just there's a lot more, which is exciting, because I've been in this industry for over 34 years from my own experience and my own treatment and my own process with this, as well as tens of thousands of patients directly and hundreds of thousands of patients indirectly. To watch what's happened the last 5-6 years is like collectively 10 times what had happened in the 25 years or longer leading up to it. So it's now rapid, so incredible right now. This is such an incredible time. And just even a couple months back, we had, I believe in Nature, an article came out basically asking, is it time to put the nail in the coffin of the somatic mutation theory of cancer? And I'm thinking, well,
It's long
yeah,
overdue.
exactly. Like, really? And so you're right. Dr. Tom Seyfried and others have kind of brought that to light over and over. But my gosh, just so your listeners remember, we started testing the nuclei, the hardware, the hard drive of our cells, which is what stores our genetic material, decades and decades and decades ago, trying to remove the healthy nuclei of a healthy cell and replace the nuclei of a cancer cell. And if this was truly a genetic disease, that would make sense, right? That it would turn that cell into a healthy and vice versa. After how many decades and how many repeated trials all over the world, it has never once panned out.
Right.
And yet this is the dominant theory up until maybe the last few years that has taken over, and an entire industry to it. And then I wanted to also speak to the point you made about the 1971, war on cancer and Nixon starting the National Cancer Institute and all these pieces. Part of that is because the world had a collective ethos. I mean, we'd come out of World War I and II, Korean War, and we were still heavily involved in the Vietnam War. And so using that terminology perhaps made sense to kind of tug on the heartstrings and the intellect of people who were honestly likely well-meaning when they went down that path. But when you have something that's now 53, 54 years later, and it's virtually changed no overall survival outcomes,
Right.
wouldn't you think you would have gotten off that train a while back,
Yeah.
a few stations back, which we haven't, and everything still perpetuates this. In fact, people like Tom Seyfried, people like Dom D'Agostino, people like myself, people, from the bedside of things, we get attacked every single day for being charlatans and snake oil salesmen. And yet we're literally looking at the same data that are, still somatic mutation theory colleagues are promoting, and we're not making the same conclusions. And so this is where I get excited about this. And so coming full circle back to this, kind of metabolic approach, if we continue to focus entirely on the tumor, which even Seyfried is doing, and even many folks in the integrative oncology space are doing, we actually won't make a bigger difference. Like, you can absolutely give pharmaceuticals to starve glutamine or glucose out of the cells, but guess what happens when you starve glutamine out of the cells? You also kill the most prominent amino acid of the healthy cells.
Yeah.
So you kill them simultaneously. And so this is where the conversations need to happen of how can we both sort of push back the tumor burden while simultaneously strengthening the terrain, the environment. And that is this beautiful sort of adaptogenic approach to the mitochondria. And this is where some of the therapies that are most successful at preventing the toxicity of standard of care and supporting the overall quality of life and overall survival rate is when we weave in things that are both restorative to the mitochondrial function while also killing the damaged mitochondria simultaneously. And that's where roles like therapeutic ketosis, cold exposure, intermittent fasting, even hyperthermia, so the other end of the spectrum. And notice it's like a massive pendulum. Any extreme will create that metabolic shift or put that pressure on the system to make the cells more sensitive. And here's where it's super interesting to me and why the work you do is so compelling. Cancer cells, weirdly, everyone's so afraid of the cancer cells, but they're actually little wussies. Like, they are super, right? Like, they do not adapt well to changes in their environment.
Fragile. They have extremely specific needs. They are
Exactly.
no good outside in a healthy body. A cancer cell is like the most vulnerable thing. It is amazing that cancer proliferates as it does.
Exactly. I love that, because I say this and some people look at me like I'm crazy because they see it as such this big, scary monster. And I'm like, it's just a cell that's lost its way. That's all. And it's relying on it's stealing certain resources. But if you actually put some pressure in, because guess what? Your healthy cells, they can tolerate those cold temperatures. They can tolerate those hot temperatures. They can tolerate being in a fasted state. They can tolerate certain bouts of certain amino acid depletion. They can tolerate certain, even light or sound frequencies that the cancer cells cannot. And so what's so weird to me is we've had all of these amazing tools around that we've not leveraged to actually enhance the standard of care treatments of today. And so I think a lot of people think because I'm a naturopathic doctor that I'm somehow anti-standard of care. I just think standard of care isn't doing enough or doing it right.
Yep.
I think it can be done better. I think it can be done more elegantly. I think it can be done with less toxicity and with a much lower dosage, and that we can leverage these other tools to simultaneously attack the cancer cells while strengthening the healthy mitochondria, which then is your best anti-cancer agent there is.
One of the things that you mentioned in your book that you haven't brought up yet is grounding, or for our colleagues in the UK, earthing. So this is the electrical connection of the body to the earth, so that electrons from the earth can rebalance the charge inside the body. In particular, this is good for circulation because red blood cells will agglomerate when they have the wrong charge. When we earth the body, the red blood cells flow more freely, blood viscosity goes down, risk of stroke goes down. But I'd never heard someone, until I read it in your book, talk about earthing in relation to oncology. So I want to ask you to expand.
Well, let's just go to one of the simplest, the lowest hanging fruits here is you talked about this agglutination. And so when we have poor perfusion, which can be caused by just inactivity, can be caused by dehydration, but can be caused by these wrongful electric charges, or wrongful polarities or ions that you're describing that creates this sort of thick, sticky stagnation. When you go to like PubMed and whatnot, and you look up one of the most vulnerable, I guess, drivers of an oncological process, first of all, it's two-sided because when someone has a diagnosis of cancer, their clotting cascade changes. But then having changes in their clotting cascade and circulation also makes them more vulnerable to cancer. And so part of the story is that Otto Warburg, all the way back in the 1920s, everyone kind of focuses on his mitochondria piece, that's where it is. But he also, the conversation that often gets left out is what's happening with oxygen. Mm-hmm. And where is that getting into the system? And what is that impacting? We've since even started to understand things about molecular hydrogen and deuterium depletion and how they all come together to change the, I'm trying to think of the way I want to word this, sort of the efficiency of the of the pathways within the mitochondria. So when we are when we are bringing in the wrong resources to our cells, and specifically to our mitochondria of those cells, everything has a tendency to kind of just get bogged up and stagnant. And I know I'm using very simplistic terms here, but I want people to just think intuitively about this, because we don't, right? And so if you are moving your body, you are oxygenating your cells, you are creating lymphatic flow, you are then taking, waste out of the system, putting it into lymphatics, dumping it through the bowel, through the urine, taking out the garbage, if you will. You are also bringing, oxygen to the far reaches of your tissues and organs, which keeps it protected from that hypoxia that can lead to disease process. You're also keeping things in flow, so you don't become sort of just sludgy and vulnerable to being a cesspool, which happens. And you also then create that charge. So Pollock's work and others have shown it's like health does have a particular frequency, a particular charge, a particular polarity. And when we're diseased, it's off. And whether that is the starting point or the response to, I think we could say it's both. I do think it's kind of an ongoing continuum, because I think it's happening in all the cells all the time, and they're constantly calibrating and figuring it out. And then for some of us, we have an area that's even more vulnerable. Maybe it's our endothelial tissue. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's issues around how we utilize or don't utilize nitric oxide. Maybe it's where we are maybe getting too much oxygen. I see a lot of people going crazy pants over oxygen therapies these days. Maybe they're actually getting too much in things of like it's hyperbaric, HOCAT, right? E-booze, ozone, insufflation, like that pushes that oxidative therapy as well. And if you are maybe single nucleotide polymorphism centric, that you've got some issues in your melatonin pathways, as you mentioned, your glutathione pathways, your SOD dismutase, your SOD, your SOD dismutase pathways, you can't deal with the basic little triggers that come to you day in, day out. And so the fact that we can now understand that one of those biggest empathic impacts is coming now from the energy of our modern day technologies, which is, of course, made it possible for you and I to even have this conversation. But man almighty, it's like we've exposed something else that for some of us, we have a higher propensity towards coagulation when we're met with certain frequencies. And we can see this on things like thermography. And by the way, I don't look at thermography. This is what you diagnose cancer with. I look at thermography for changes in inflammatory processes and circulation, because where things pool, things stagnate and things accumulate. That's never a good sign for any condition, cancer included. And so this is what we can see easily. Like Dr. Deborah Davis is one of the speakers we're having at our conference in Tucson next month, or in October.
I'll be there.
Good. I know. I'm so excited. We'll talk about that in a moment. We're so honored. But she is, she was one of the early whistleblowers on the impacts. She wrote the book Disconnect, which just hit its 10th year anniversary last year, in an updated, revised version, where you could see changes in the thermal, the thermography of the brain and the glucose uptake of the brain just by holding a cell phone to your ear. Like, those are the main things that we have lots of evidence that just those simple macro exposures are causing problems. We are just starting to crack the code on what's happening at the micro level. And you mentioned Dr. Cruz, and I know it makes me sad that his delivery is as it is, because I appreciate the message, and I can separate that sometimes from the messenger. And I can understand that people are turned off by the messenger, but the man is freaking brilliant. And he has a really important message that everybody needs to listen to, because this is the future. I mean, even the head of integrative oncology at MD Anderson says the future of integrative oncology and oncology in general is quantum. Right. And so I just kind of spewed a lot of things at you guys, but I'm just trying to get you to think about what didn't exist 100 years ago. Incandescent light bulbs, what didn't exist 100 years ago? Tesla cars,
Right.
What didn't exist 100 years? Screen time, like all of these things. We were living in what I call the little house on the prairie days: chop wood, carry water, average of 4 hours outdoors every day. There was really no signs of even cardiovascular disease until the late 1800s, early 1900s, because we weren't giving our bodies the opportunity to agglutinate. And we were constantly grounded. We were constantly charged. Our shoes were made of materials that made complete contact with the earth below our feet. The materials of our homes had contact with the environment around us. Every single thing we've constructed for ease, for convenience, has actually taken us further and further away from health and longevity.
There are so many things here that I want to translate for the engineers in our audience, if I might. But where you just ended reminded me what our grandparents used to call work or discomfort or hardship, we now call therapy. Our grandparents used to split wood, and now we go to the gym. Our grandparents used to bundle up and shovel their snow, and now we have heated leather seats and we've got to get an ice bath. What our grandparents used to call hardship, we now explore for therapy. And we're very lucky to be able to, our grandparents worked hard and they put us in a position where we could be comfortable. And our triple pane, double glazed, infrared resistant, whatever windows are now killing us, even as they shave $10 a month off of our, power bill.
Yeah.
So if I could work backwards through a few things, one of them is the stickiness of the red blood cells. When you say perfusion, we should be clear. This is about the delivery of the blood to wherever we're talking about in the body. And I think that a lot of people, at least with my background in engineering, they don't realize that some of the blood vessels, the capillaries through which red blood cells must travel, are even smaller than the red blood cells themselves. If the red blood cells are stuck together by some, minute I'm going to call it microscopic, but that's not even the right scale, lesser than that, electric charge, because you're not grounded. Those agglomerated red blood cells will never fit through the capillaries as they're supposed to. And so you won't be delivering to that tissue the blood that it needs. So there's perfusion. The deuterium depleted water. I only understand like 30% of what Jack Kruse says. But
I think that's more than I understand. So well done.
I go from the assumption that he's right, and I just haven't figured it out yet. And deuterium was one of those. Here's what people like, my engineering colleagues don't understand. We live in an industrial age, and it is very common for us to use machines, which are so much simpler, to try and explain the way the body works. One of the most egregious offenders was Schoolhouse Rock, which I loved when I was a kid. They used to play it to us in elementary school, and I can still sing, conjunction, junction, right? Right. These are supposed to be educational music videos, but when it came to health, they were all wrong. Our nervous system is not a telegraph line. In machines, we transmit charge with electrons that travel on the surface of a copper or aluminum wire or something like that. But it's not the way the cells transmit charge. Cells do it by moving protons. Now, the electron is negatively charged, the proton is positively charged, and the difference is that the proton has mass where the electron doesn't. So if the cell is going to move charge by moving protons, deuterium has a neutron attached to it as well. And that means the deuterium has twice the mass, right? Yeah. That makes it all the much more difficult for the cell to move it. So you're talking about a proton gradient or a proton pump or something. When there's too many neutrons attached to those protons, when you're talking about deuterium instead of water, then you develop a resistance to that charge movement. It slows down the process of moving charge inside the cell. So according to my understanding of Jack, and I've already prefaced this, that much of what he says is over my head, the mitochondria, which are responsible for moving these charges, certainly they govern the redox reactions that transfer electrons, but they also must create these proton gradients, the proton movements. And to facilitate this, they will deplete the water around the mitochondria of deuterium so that they can be more effective. If you drink too much deuterium, if you're supplying too much deuterium to your body, you make it all the harder for the mitochondria to move that charge. And this goes to the third thing that I'm hoping to translate. This word quantum, it has become a catchphrase. And it sort of means, well, I'm one of those people who thinks like this instead of that. But people have removed the word quantum from its meaning in physics and using it instead as kind of a way to signal a set of beliefs or approaches. And this is fine. But I want to talk about what quantum means. As engineering students, we're in, we got to take 3 courses in physics, and we always start with Newton's laws of motion. Each one of these courses in physics is supported by calculus. And in calculus, all the problems are identical. They are all different variations of infinity times 0. And so the engineers have to make this simplifying assumption that you can divide the number line into infinitesimally small slices, and then you can add them all back up again. So you can do calculus, which Newton and Leibniz invented, so you can solve these problems in Newtonian physics. All that is great. Physicians typically don't get as much math as the engineers do. The problem with that Newtonian approach is that it breaks down at small scales. The number line in the abstract is infinitesimally, divisible, but the human body is not. There is a scale at which calculus no longer applies. You may not divide the number line any further. And quantum is a word that we use to say at that scale, you cannot do the same calculus. You cannot do Newtonian physics. There are different rules of physics that apply where you cannot find an in-between space between, for example, 2 electron shells. It is no longer divisible. And so what you experience, which is Newtonian, imagine a friction-free plane, or, what happens to the projectile that's shot out of the cannon? And we can see this with our senses. quantum we cannot detect with our sight or our touch or our sense of sound or smell or any. Now we all operate. The quantum processes are essential to the complex, thermodynamic beings that we are. And so I wanted to insert what quantum really means is that the Newtonian laws of physics that exist at this macro scale, baseball, football, the
Mhm.
things that we're used to, they do not govern what is happening inside our bodies because we are not made up of number lines. We are
Yes.
not machines. So
Yeah.
we need a new premise, a new physics to really decode
Mm.
what is going on inside the human body. And that physics is predicated on quantum phenomena, those phenomena that are not divisible to an infinitely small scale. Okay, so that's me
Love it.
trying to make sense, as an engineer of what is going on at the leading edge of medicine now. And I should allow you to comment.
Well, first of all, I really love that you differentiated because you're right. On the social media plane, you're seeing a lot of folks speaking quantum, but it's definitely more, like you said, more of a philosophy or a belief system.
They
Whereas
don't know what
when I was,
quantum
yeah,
is, right?
right. And so for me, I was speaking to more of these on I've never thought about the way you just described it because we aren't, like what's really happening inside of us does not fit the measurements of the
Correct.
old, it's like there needs to make room for a new way of describing what's happening.
Our
And
brains are not computers. Our bodies are not, phone systems.
yeah,
Our digestive tract is not an internal combustion engine. These metaphors are not just oversimplified, they're wrong. And
yeah,
we should reject them because we are complex systems. There is now a big movement. Brian Johnson is its
yeah,
leading spokesperson on bio-optimization.
yeah,
It's an oxymoron. Nothing biological can be optimized. And so that pathway, which is
yeah,
the residue of the Industrial Revolution, which is the type of thinking that motivated Nixon to sign that damn bill
yeah,
with his war metaphors. The Industrial Revolution is winding down, but the concepts of the Industrial Revolution that are no longer working, they are still with us. And they're leading us to make incorrect inferences
yeah,
about how to intervene in our broken human systems. We need to go the other way. We don't need a human genome project. We
no.
need a human sort of bioharmony
Mm,
project. We need to get in touch with the environment that our bodies were built for. Whether you are,
yes,
a creationist or whether you think that Darwin had everything right, doesn't matter. Our
right.
bodies are organized for certain contact with the environment. And when we move away from the way our bodies are endowed, it's no wonder we lapse into a state of dis-ease.
Exactly. It's I think why it's just intuitive for me, and I still am with you. I don't know exactly the answer of how we teach this in. I think what got me closer to it is because I studied for 13 years. I studied Ayurveda and I have a doctorate in Oriental medicine as well. These medical systems understand the relationship between our internal environment with our external environment way better than allopathic
Mm-hmm,
medicine has ever even come close to
mm-hmm.
understanding. And it's interesting that now we are creating research, you know, projects that start to sort of validate or verify or justify what the ancient Ayurveds were saying or the ancient Chinese practitioners were saying to make sense of it. And it is making sense at that quantum level, like it's a very different discussion. And yet it's still so, at the, it's still so kind of considered the fringe, I
Mm-hmm.
suppose. And so what's interesting to me about the gentleman at MD Anderson is he's actually the one who's done the largest amount of research in academic institutions in the United States on homeopathy
Mm-hmm.
and its role in cancer in
I'm glad to
particular.
hear it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so he, of course, his colleagues, like it's amazing, he has maintained a job at MD Anderson all these years because that is, people are trying to constantly shut that down and talk about explaining. You sound like you're coming from another planet when you try and explain to somebody homeopathy. But what you just described with Newton's physics and quantum
Mhm.
is literally the way you describe homeopathy.
Well, I had an argument with a colleague because you know that I'm a professor at Arizona State
Yep.
University. I am steeped in science, and science is predicated on this reductionist approach to
Yeah.
simplify everything. It leads to misconceptions. One of those misconceptions is side effects. In a reductionist laboratory experiment, you do your best to eliminate all confounding variables, and you want to get the straightest line through the data that you can and get your R squared, whatever. When we do that in medicine,
Yeah.
we're treating the human as if they were an experimental subject rather than as a patient. And it's terrible because it leads to this idea that one pill can treat one symptom and leave everything else constant, as if it were a reductionist scientific experiment. And we invent this term side effects as if we were going to marginalize everything else that is happening in the human body. There's no such thing as a side effect. There are only effects. We are complex creatures, and you cannot intervene in any aspect of the human body without expecting to change everything in the human body. The scientific method resists that realization. It isn't really built for complex systems, although it can be adaptive. So I have this argument with a colleague, and he's saying, well, homeopathy, of course, that's bull crap. And I said, well, hang on. According to whichever data you want to cite, iatrogenic injury, so this is medical errors, are either the third leading cause of death or the first leading cause of death in the United States right now. Have you ever seen homeopathy kill anybody? And he'd never thought about it this way, that simply avoiding iatrogenic injury leads to a medical benefit. So that hopefully, just that fact alone will open the door and get people more curious about homeopathy. I am not ready to abandon science. Like I'm still going to go where the data takes me, but I will not be blind to the limitations of this standard sort of reductionist approach.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you're
And I
saying so
think,
many things that bring out the editorial nature in me.
but I love it because this is the conversation that needs to be happening in every academic institution, in every clinic, in every cafe, because we have given all of our power over to a failed system.
Correct.
And it's like, I believe we are smart enough. We don't even access a significant portion of our brain to actually come up with a better model.
Correct.
And one of the things people have heard me say over the last few years, I have learned more as a clinician, as a doctor. I have learned more to help my patients with cancer from the engineers than I have from other doctors.
Sure.
And the reason being is because you guys are systems thinkers.
Yeah.
We have got to go to a systems model. And that's what's difficult. So now I'm training clinicians all over the world. And it's so funny because I feel like I have to spend the first month or two sort of dismantling their linear thought process and helping them start to see all of the connections that are out there, that you can't separate them or silo them off. And when we look at our research, as you said, it is so like, talk about an unnatural environment. Right? An RCT clinical trial is as unnatural as it gets.
Correct.
It is not like that out in the real world. Right? And so this is where we have to look at, and I believe there's some really cool things coming down the pipeline with this, of looking at this differently, which is also part of how we start to answer or look at and maybe ask different questions when it comes to how do we both prevent, most importantly, and treat cancer and support survivorship and longevity after it's come through. And so that's the place. If we keep looking to the same system and asking the same questions, we get nowhere. And I feel like this is where my benefits, my why I've done well in the way that I see and do things, is because I'm asking different questions and I'm coming to different conclusions, and therefore we're trying different approaches. And as such, most of them come back to realizing, by a deep level of interaction, questions, history taking, evaluation, biometrics, all the things, shows me honestly how far someone has gotten from their natural evolution, like from their natural genetics. Like, how far off are you from the way you were intended to live on this planet? And the vast majority of people, as you mentioned earlier, are walking around completely unaware. We have normalized the abnormal in such a way that when somebody like me questions that narrative, I get labeled as a charlatan
Right.
or as a quack, And so it's just an interesting time to be on the planet today. Because I would really challenge your listeners, like, think about a time when you felt absolutely alive in every cell of your being. It's
It
never
was
going
not in my fluorescent lit office on campus.
right. Exactly. Like there's like, I can't, would anybody answer that it would happen, in the constructs of this? And like, think about going to a hospital, the sickest place on earth.
Yeah.
Right. And that's what something else I'm working on building is the hospital of the
What a great
future.
question, because you just brought me back to graduate school. I remember
Cool.
feeling alive. It was on the summit of St. Regis Mountain in the Adirondacks during the summer, up northern New York. The days are so long, and I'd found wild blueberries. And right, I mean, it's just not a weird memory for that was how many 35 years ago. And in that moment, I felt very much alive.
Oh my God. And what you were actually remembering was not just your experience, but your ancestors' experience.
Correct.
Because they were identical.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
That's
I
so
am wired
beautiful.
to remember that.
Yeah.
Wild blueberries, that could be the difference between your survival and your perishing.
That's amazing. Amazing. That just gives me such goosebumps there. And yeah, so I think that that's what these conversations lead us to is like, what are our mitochondria asking of us?
Yeah.
Maybe that's where this conversation starts with whoever's listening today. Maybe that's where it starts. Like, let's just go back to the basics because we've so either oversimplified in Western medicine, our approach of just cut, burn, poison, or even just deplete glucose and glutamine or what have you. But when we forget that it's the environment that those cells are interacting in is what makes or breaks the response, makes or breaks those cells being, in sort of synergy, a symbiotic relationship with the body, or going rogue and forgetting who they belong to. That is what we get to work with shifting in each and every individual we come in contact with.
I have maybe it's one more question, and it's not an easy question to ask. So I'm going to have to work my way up to it. If anyone's listened this long, this is the question I've been dying to ask.
Oh, no. Okay, I'm ready.
I understand why children get type 1 diabetes. My son was diagnosed when he was 6 years old. And I now understand, although I didn't at the time, it was because he had a deficiency of vitamin D during the first year of life when his immune system was developing. And that deficiency left him vulnerable to autoimmune disorders. Okay. I understand why children get autism. There's a deficiency in their mitochondria during the neurological development that happens during pregnancy in utero and during the first 2-3 years of life. And it causes these atypical neurological development pathways that then can be activated by the immune system or inflammation in the brain that triggers the onset. I understand these things. I don't understand why children get cancer.
Yeah. That one hurts even every time that question is asked. It's such it's one that I think that we definitely aren't asking the question, but let me answer it the way I understand it. When I look at you, Prof. Seager, right? Like just look at you. You are not just you. You were in your mother's eggs while she was in your grandmother's womb.
Right.
So it's not just like when people are like, well, this kid didn't have stressors. They weren't drinking alcohol. They weren't eating a processed diet. They weren't, well, actually it goes upstream at least to, some studies show upwards of 12, ancestors north of them. Right. And so thinking if this is a mitochondrial disease, and typically a maternal mitochondrial disease passed down through the mother maternal lineage, you need to understand what was your grandmother exposed to mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, toxic wise? What was her state of mind? What was her diet? What was her nutritional excesses or deficiencies? What were the conditions of the time, the exposures of the time, the belief systems, the culture of the time around her? And then how did that impact, your mother in her ovaries, in her body, and then downstream from there? And so it starts before. And what's difficult about this conversation is I will get hate mail after this, because then people are going to say, you're blaming
It's
the
a
mother.
very
Or the
difficult thing. Yep.
It's a very difficult thing. I'm like, way to hold your horses here, because we don't know what we don't know until we know. And so I look at mine. So I was 19 years old when I was diagnosed with terminal ovarian cancer in 1991. That was not normal nor common. Unfortunately, it's far more common today. In fact, one of the oncologists who now follows my work, it's because we had 4 children under the age of 10 with stage 4 ovarian cancer. Now, that is where you go, what the actual F, right? That's where you sit there and go. So one of the things that I started learning about my own genetics later on, so mine was like a reverse engineering. I knew in 1996, I was one of the early being tested for the BRCA mutation. That's where I learned that I had serious problems with DNA repair and methylation issues. That's all that is. That's not a cancer gene, by the way, folks. Everyone calls it that. It's not. It's a DNA repair mechanism, and it's a methylation mechanism. And that is incredibly powerfully under control of our diet and lifestyle choices. So did not know that until years after my diagnosis. The other thing is my mom joked about kicking the ashtray off her belly when I was growing up. And there's actually multiple studies about cigarette exposure to, especially with BRCA mutation. So first, second, and even third hand, but especially in vitro, and specifically to ovarian cancer. When I was in junior high and high school as an avid volleyball player, very, very big athlete, we all just powdered the bejesus out of our vajayjays with Johnson & Johnson baby powder, because no one would dare have something that smelled or was perceived as sweaty or stinky. And so the amount of that I was applying to my very vulnerable genitalia as it was, coming of age, that probably didn't help matters. I lived on 4 super fun sites, but also my mom's state of mind. Before I was born, she carried a stillborn. She carried a stillborn to delivery when no one listened to her. She knew something was wrong and no one listened to her. And when they finally figured out what was going on, they forced her to carry to term and then forced her to deliver this baby. And then no one would talk about it or let her grieve it or have a proper ceremony. So that level of trauma that she carried before getting pregnant with me again filtered in. The type of relationship she had with my father filtered in, going upstream into my grandmother and beyond. My grandmother, my mom was 7 years old when her father died, right? It's like, I look at the traumas, the ACE scores that came down through her generations into mine. My ACE score was a 10 out of 10, adverse childhood event score, the toxins. So when we talk about, how do kids get cancer, the reality is that, the pollution to solution, the solution to pollution is
another
dilution.
Nixon saying.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
We absorb, think about when we now know there's over 200 chemicals in the breath, in the cord blood alone today. So of course, this is the place that we've got over 88,000 chemicals that have come to market since the 1960s. We have a whole different way, the way we produce food in this world that is just nothing like nature intended. We're exposed to far more difficult, we put more pressure on our mitochondria with the amount of sugar we've been taking in compared to what we did 100, 150 years ago. And then the lack of sunshine and the lack, the fear of the sun and the fear of fat have completely led our bodies astray. And so what's more miraculous for me, Prof. Seager, is that I'm actually so grateful that not more children are born with cancer or young and diagnosed with cancer. But I will say that the cancer rates in children and pediatrics are on the rise again. And that is, we kind of had a nice stable line for many years, but it's spiking again, and it's not genetics, folks.
Right.
It's and the other thing here is we're seeing a huge rise in cancer among younger and younger people when
Correct.
it was always considered a disease of the aged. Well, when you think about this, your mitochondria are your fountain of youth.
Correct.
They are your longevity. So basically what's happening is we are being born with older and older mitochondria.
Okay. Let me see if I can do a little interpretation translation. There are three routes of inheritance. You have alluded to all of them. The first one is the one that we learn in high school biology. Get some chromosomes from dad, you get some chromosomes from mom, and they make a baby, and there's a new, unique individual with its own DNA. And what you pointed out is that all of your mother's eggs are formed when she is in your grandmother's womb. Whatever, that's all her raw material. There ain't going to be any new eggs. And so your grandmother, I'm thinking about Grammy right now. I'm thinking about my mother being born at the tail end of the Depression. And all of the eggs that must have formed in my mother's ovaries when she was in this fetal state, and what was my grandmother exposed to? Okay, so there's one route of inheritance, and it goes back a lot further than we thought. For me, like almost 100 years is when I'm thinking about the egg that became me was formed. Okay. Second route of inheritance is the mitochondria. Mitochondria have their own DNA, and they do not reproduce sexually the way the DNA in the nucleus is. So mitochondria are inherited exclusively from the mother. Now, they're more subject to mutations. That is a higher rate of mutation because they have less protection than the DNA in the nucleus. But because they do not reproduce sexually, they are more constant than the DNA in the nucleus. And so the mitochondria that I have are hypothetically, as a first approximation, the same as my mother, the same as my grandmother, the same as my great grandmother, and going back through my maternal lineage to Eve.
Yeah.
That's a little oversimplified, but it's one way of thinking about that second route of inheritance.
Yeah.
Here's the third route, which you alluded to, but you didn't mention. It is the inheritance of the epigenome.
Yes.
The epigenome is modified by experience, but what we've now discovered, it's not just the DNA and the nucleus that you get from your parents. It is also the epigenome that will turn that DNA on or off. No, so methylation is one of the mechanisms that will modify the expression of your genes. The offspring are prepared by the parental experience.
Yeah.
They inherit the modifications in the epigenome so that they don't have to be trained. They don't have to think about it. Their DNA will respond by synthesizing RNA that become proteins in response to whatever environmental stimulus caused this epigenetic modification. Okay, so there's three routes of inheritance. The DNA in the nucleus we all know about, but it goes back further than we thought. The mitochondria, which is exclusively maternal, and it goes back a long way too, and the epigenome, which is the experiences that your parents and great parent, whatever. Okay.
Wow.
Now, what you're saying is our children are coming into this world with this accumulation of potentially injury or mutation or trauma, for example, in the epigenome, with these modifications that might have happened at their grandparents or at their parents' life stages, but they inherit, even if it wasn't presenting as an abnormality in the parent or the grandparent, it can leave the child with a vulnerability that they've inherited. Okay. And the other thing that you're saying is the rate of assault upon that child, and in particular their mitochondria, is greater than it ever has been. We're not talking just Love Canal, where they built a school on top of a toxic waste dump. We are talking about what we consider food. We're talking about what we're putting in the school lunches. We're talking about the screens and the non-native EMFs. We're not just talking about, breathing in tire dust in the Superfund sites that you grew up at. We're talking about things that we are being told aren't hurting us in the least. The 87 different vaccine doses that I was never subjected to as a child, that all act on the immune system, which we're counting on to function well, to suppress the proliferation of cancer, we have now perturbed in ways. This is incomplete for me because I cannot detach myself from these moral intuitions. Those kids didn't do anything wrong. And yet here they are carrying the burden of all of this perturbation, of all of these assaults upon the mitochondria. And it bothers the hell out of me that they would report to the oncology ward for chemotherapy and then be offered French fries and corn syrup ketchup, as the meal in the hospital. And I don't have kids with cancer, and I have never visited those oncology wards, and I don't have the temperament for it. It's partly why I'm an engineer. And I'd forgotten that you yourself are a cancer survivor, and that your story informs this question of why do children get cancer, because you were an adolescent when you got yours. No wonder you're in the field that you're in now. Yeah.
I feel that. And I really think you're an amazing teacher and an amazing translator to take a very difficult concept and help people understand that it's a lot more complicated, but it's also something that I feel like is my why, and even your why, of how we might not be able to save our own generations, but I am certainly not giving up on the future ones. And perhaps each moment of awareness, each moment of sort of enlightenment we have, we can make this better for the next generations to come.
I am fortunate because readers will send me their labs. Readers will send me their PET scans, and they will say, Professor Seager, I have shrunk my tumor, by 3 centimeters or by 50% or whatever. Brown fat is showing up in my body because I adopted cold plunge therapy. I didn't even tell my oncologist about it, And so the good news comes in to me a lot faster than the bad news does. And then I'll write up a new case study. I'll do an addendum on an article. I feel like before I let you go, I should talk a little bit about cold plunge, because we do have some remarkable case studies. It is not just clearing glucose from the bloodstream, starving the cancer cells. There's also the mitobiogenesis that is stimulated by cold plunge therapy that can help restore mitochondrial function, and in that way combat cancer. Will you speak a little bit about your own experiences or your knowledge?
Well, I mean, my gosh, you just nailed one of the potential mechanisms of action. We definitely know that it changes. So as someone who's got lymphedema secondary to all the disease burden I had in my pelvis, the one thing that keeps me kind of in tune is to do alternating hot and cold. That's been my gig for 30 some years. I'm like doing it way before any biohacker, influencer said this was cool to do. And it's the one thing that helps change the flow of my lymph system. So it helps my body take out the garbage in a more profound way. It definitely changes my HRV, my heart rate variability. And we absolutely know that folks with a lower, in fact, I'm getting ready to present on this and vagal nerve tone and HRV and its relationship to cancer at a big conference in San Diego next month at the IMMH, actually.
What a good idea.
I know, really interesting, right? Yeah. And so we know that I can't do anything for a patient who's revving in a sympathetic nervous system state. Nothing can land, chemotherapy, alternative therapy, etc. But one of the tools that can help somebody achieve a parasympathetic state is this application of cold. And it's just super powerful for increasing that HRV and increasing that vagal tone, which then literally that innervates every major function of the body and basically gets everything optimized. Yeah.
Okay, people know that I like going super cold, ice chunks floating in there. I'll do 2, maybe 3 or 4 minutes. They know what I do. What do you do?
So I do somewhere between 49 and 55 degrees is what
Okay.
I'm doing.
Yep.
Now, I will, believe me, I was just in last year in San Moritz, Switzerland. I was at a Keto Live summit with some of the brightest researchers, like, oh my God, the best of the best in the field, of like Isabella Cooper and Dom D'Agostino and all these folks. And we got a bunch of doctors. It was 32 degrees. And I was like, they were all so resistant. We're like, we're going to go jump in San Moritz Lake at 6 a.m.
Heck
And they're
yeah.
like, so it was 32 degrees in the air and 32 degrees in the water. And we all got in, and most of us hung out for at least 30 seconds. Some made it up to 3 minutes. Everyone was so surprised that they could do it.
Of course.
Everyone was
Yeah.
resistant. And then it became a ritual every day. This year we came back, the water was a lot warmer. It was about 47 degrees. So it felt like literally pleasant at that point. But what was really intriguing for me is to just see that like one person has one experience with it and they're basically hooked for life.
Yep.
And it was so fun because all of them wear like wearables of continuous glucose monitors and HRV, and everyone was reporting in their own little N of one experiment.
Yep.
And so what I've learned for me as a woman who's now postmenopausal, I will do those really cold ones here and there as just a little potentiator, bing, 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 like a little hormesis. But my day-to-day routine is a more of a temperate, like a 49 to 55 is my sweet spot. And that's what I can do daily without creating more stress and duress to my body. I like it. I like to have the ice chips, but it does, doing those too many in a row for me as a woman postmenopausally actually creates a high cortisol spike for me, which then spikes my insulin. So not a good dance with my chemistry, but
How long do you stay in?
3 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you feel a gas reflex when you get in at 49 or 50?
Yeah, for sure. Well, especially because I'm in Colorado right now doing this. So the air is actually colder than my water in the
Yep.
mornings.
Yep.
And so it's like you kind of have to mentally psych yourself to walk out the door and, drop the robe or the towel to hop in. But man, it's such I don't feel like my day is complete without that now. And so it's a real treat to have access. Now, when I'm down in Mexico, which is where I live most of the year, it's always much warmer. So I will keep the water more like probably 45 to 49, just because I need more of that contrast for how warm it is there.
Well, you're coming down to Phoenix soon.
Yes.
And I want to invite you to our studios. It'll still be, 110 degrees when you're here. And so
Great.
if you are up for it, we'll get you into one of those super cold with the ice chunks, and then we'll go outside, 110 degrees. We'll do some lunges or some squats or something. We'll rewarm in the sunshine. How does it sound?
I am so down. I would love to do that. Yes, yes, yes.
Wonderful. We'll get a little bit more media, and perhaps we'll have some further reflections based upon feedback that we get from our listeners on this podcast. So I want to encourage the listeners, write to me. Find me on Twitter. It's Seager TP on Instagram. Please share your impressions, your additional questions. You can post them as comments on our blog. We have several articles about cancer. And if something comes up, because we really should have talked about it, then maybe we'll have a chance in a month when we get together again, Nasha, and we can address some of those reader questions.
I'd be honored. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me. This has been so helpful, educational, and kind of fun.
Ditto.